All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural edition of the University of Texas Energy Institute Live podcast. This is indeed our maiden voyage, so we'll see how this goes. Thanks for everybody who is joining here at UT. We're in KUT's Studio 1A. The public radio affiliate, the NPR affiliate here in town, was gracious enough to let us use their space to record this podcast. So we're super grateful, really excited about to see kind of how this goes, honestly. Thanks for everybody who's joining us on Zoom too. If you have questions, write them in the comment section, sort of in the chat, and we can figure out. Dr. Josh Busby, who is the person who was responsible for putting this all together, is going to be moderating. He's going to be checking out the questions. He'll send them up to us. He'll ask them for you. So if you have questions online, please submit them. We are all ears. He's also been thinking about this topic for a while. I have too. We're going to be talking about India's energy transition. We're going to be discussing specifically the challenges facing making that transition just for all Indians, but also sort of trying to figure out exactly all of the different barriers, the different opportunities. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Here to spend the hour with us is perhaps the person most equipped to discuss this issue in depth. Sandeep Pai is director of Swaniti. Wait, did I do it right?
Yeah.
Swaniti?
Yeah.
Perfect. Swaniti Global. He's working at the intersection of climate action and economic development. You've had such an interesting journey to be here. He was a journalist with leading Indian newspapers, researcher and scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before this, I was joking with you. I feel like I probably sent you an email asking you questions about all of these things because I used to report for Marketplace and I would call CSIS all the time asking for sources. He's actually a host of a podcast called India Energy Hour as well. So he might turn the tables on me. That's totally fine. If you want to ask me some questions, I'm going to fake like I know the answers. So we're going to see if I can hang here. Sandeep, you're now living in North Carolina. Thank you so much for you're in the Research Triangle, Raleigh-Durham area. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Welcome to Austin and Texas. This is your first time here, right?
Yes, very much.
Perfect.
So thank you so much,
Yeah.
Andy. And it's really a pleasure to be talking to you. We were having some, dinner last night, and I really enjoyed talking to you about these issues. And I'm excited to go deeper. And I also wanted to thank Professor Josh Busby, who is responsible for bringing me here and, spearheading this very important topic that we're about to discuss.
Perfect.
So thank you.
So I'm going to get out of the way most of the time here. Again, like I said, if y'all have questions, please submit them on the Zoom. But first, I was talking about your interesting history, just so people have a better sense of why they should be listening to you talk about all this stuff. Give us a sense of how you got into this space because it's been an interesting journey. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in small town India, and when you're growing up in small town India about 20 years ago, um, you have two options. You're not successful if you're two options if you don't do one of the two options.
Sure.
You either become an engineer or you become a doctor.
Right.
So I at that time I was just like, fine, I'll do engineering. I did engineering. It was interesting, but I understood very early on that this is not something I would enjoy very, very long term. I didn't know at that time what I would enjoy, but I was sure that this is not something I would enjoy.
So give us some context. When you say small town India,
Yeah.
tell us where you are and also just so we have a sense how many people,
Yeah.
what it feels like if you're walking down the street. I mean,
Sure.
yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So I grew up in what was erstwhile a state called Bihar, one of the poorest states in India. I was born in Ranchi, the state that later got bifurcated into two.
Okay.
So while I was born in Bihar, by the time I was just got to my senses, it became Jharkhand.
Okay.
So it is also a mineral-rich state. It is one of the largest coal producers, one of the largest producers of other minerals. So I think in some ways that shaped the topic consciously or subconsciously. But anyway, so I finished the engineering. After that, I worked for a tech company for a for a very short stint. And then I somehow stumbled upon journalism.
Hmm,
At that time, most most journalists in India came from history, arts, English literature background. So maybe the editor took a pity on me and said, like, you look different,
sure.
so come and do some data work. I don't think he knew what data work meant. I don't think I knew what data, but I got in, and like with every job you learn. And so in the big,
Because just to give a sense too, we talk about data journalism now, and you see these really
yeah,
cool things that are happening in the New York Times, and you have
right,
these flash maps, and you have all
yeah,
this really cool data stuff. That was absolutely not happening, even in the
nothing.
United States, but certainly not in India, right?
Absolutely not. So data journalism was a like a buzzword,
Yeah.
but what it really meant, not in the way, you have these cool maps which are pointing to I mean, this was like really basic stuff, like take data that government has given you and just create graph in
Literally like
Excel.
a census
Like,
census data,
yeah,
things like
or
that.
just pick an interesting trend and write something about it. So that was the mandate. But when I got in, I was covering municipal stuff, like everything under the sun.
And this was a
uh,
small newspaper in
this was not a small, this
okay,
is a mid-size. It was called Daily News and Analysis.
okay,
This is in Bombay,
okay.
and it was not very small at that. I mean, it was a mid-size English newspaper. I did a bit of that. Then I got transferred into special stories. That was transformative. Special stories team. That was transformative. It allowed me to travel a lot. I've been to almost every state in India, covered all kinds of topics uh, from sort of issues of the LTT issue in Sri Lanka to like I mean at a superficial level, as a reporter,
Mm.
not I've covered like earthquake in Kathmandu, and I've written a lot on coal. Even then, it was just a topic which was picking up, but I personally had no idea about climate change or any. This was really from a coal markets, what's happening on the policy front. So I did all of that. It was really transformative. It helped shape. I saw, you know, villages, towns, cities, not just in India but in Nepal and Sri
So
Lanka.
when you were talking about sort of starting out and reporting on coal initially,
Yeah.
during that time, did coal have sort of the quote unquote black eye that it had here, where it was we need to sort of I mean, we've been talking about a transition away from coal for 30, 40, 50 years here in the US. You came from a coal mining district.
Yeah.
The attitude toward the industry, was it different, especially when you moved in? Go ahead. Yeah.
Not even today.
Okay.
I don't think that overwhelmingly people are opposed to coal.
Hmm,
Neither the residents nor the government, not the state government, nor uh, I mean India's trajectory, and we can talk about it in detail
sure.
if we get to that, is very different. The stage in which India is compared to the United States is quite different. So a lot of reporting that was happening, there was supposedly what was a coal scam in India,
Hmm.
which was really about how coal blocks are allocated to companies. You know,
What
because
does that mean? What do you mean?
what
Yeah.
that means is like um, for the last 50 years, coal was mined by state-owned companies.
Okay.
But then in 1991, Government of India decided to liberalize as part of the larger liberalization of the country, and allocate coal blocks to private companies to come and explore and all of that. But there was allegation that a lot of this was done without any auctions, without any and
If you knew somebody and you owned a coal company.
yeah, exactly,
Right,
and or
right.
not just the coal company, but in the ministry
Sure.
and so on. There was a huge like a comptroller and auditor general report
Hmm.
talking about a notional loss, and that was the time when I really got into this space. I had an editor who said, like, go travel to every mine, report what's happening. So I really got to see every mine, and like not every mine, there's 500 mines, but
Sure.
I spent months and months going one up, one mine, one area after the other. So that's where I really kind of got a sense of like, okay, this is a sector. Again, climate is is it was still not in my orbit. This is really pure, scam reporting. This is pure policy reporting at that time. And this is, I'm talking about 2012, 2013,
Right.
2014, that period.
Right.
Yeah. Um,
And so the attitudes, if you're traveling to different mines in different
yeah.
regions and different sort of throughout India, I imagine the perception
Yeah.
of what this is doing for our obviously for our economic development, but was there concern about we have a bunch of kids that are getting sick, we have a bunch of kids with sort of asthma and breathing problems. Was that part of the narrative at all, or
Yes, so
okay?
environmental justice,
Yeah,
if I can use that word
sure.
for to describe, just to distinguish between when we start talking about just transition,
Right,
environmental justice from the point of view of like our polluted, rivers and local air pollution and all, those are those have been concerns, but the development needs of some of these rural places are so high that any industry that is coming, regardless of whether it's coal or anything, the appetite for anything, any kind of like major industry was big.
those are jobs.
Those are jobs. But what is even more important, that those jobs came from state-owned companies.
Right,
They are not purely driven by profit. They spend, and I can get into lots of data on that, but like they run 500 hospitals,
yeah,
they run like schools. So any coal company, when they come, I mean, I'm not painting them as like some kind of like, but it is also a complex reality where the same people may have water pollution,
right,
but they're employed,
right.
and they're getting good salary
Or
and
or they're bringing in two parks and two hospitals and something.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
And so say there is a hospital for only the employees, but the entire district will use it
Right.
because schools and hospitals are not functional to the same standards and degree. And Coal India would, like companies, state-owned companies like Coal India would allow that
Hmm.
free treatment. It's also a way of social contract for them to operate. And so it's a complex story. It's not simply like I don't like coal, kind of.
What was the sort of deregulation and the and or I guess the sort of opening up to private industry, was that inviting international speculators to come in? Was it basically just Indian companies who, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it was all private Indian companies. FDI was not allowed
Okay.
in most things, not just so. This is within the larger system, right? FDI, foreign direct investment, was still coming in many sectors, one after the other.
Right.
So this is really domestic actors. And one interesting thing is like that story has not been successful,
Right.
regardless, because of the social contract that state-owned enterprises have,
Huh.
because people trust them. They still Indians, most Indians, I think I can say this, are still left of center.
Hmm.
They still believe in welfare. They still want they're looking up to government. So a government companies is much much like desirable. And this is a company, um, which became a state-owned company overnight.
Hmm.
It is an overnight decision. So let me just go back
Sure.
200 years.
Yeah.
So British came, they started promoting small
We're
mines.
we're talking about a journey here, y'all.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
So very very small mines, you know like small meaning like almost like 5 acre, 10 acre mines. And they were like, go do mining. And there were like hundreds and hundreds, 200, 300, 500 small mafia, like local players who were doing it. But this was what was called, slaughtered mining
Hmm.
was happening, like no scientific method, like really like people were treated badly. And then,
Like wildcatting here in Texas
right,
for oil, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So but then there was a prime minister who came, who believed in socialism. Like her general outlook was very socialism, and she was nationalizing everything.
Okay.
So what happened is, overnight, all these companies, small little companies, their assets were taken away and made into one company, Coal India Limited, which is also world's largest coal mining company
Hmm.
today, which produces about 10 to 15% of coal globally. So it's a one massive company. And all these people who are working in these like private bonded labor type mines are suddenly government of India
Right.
employees,
Right.
right? So
And being a government employee is
pensionable,
it's
full
great, right?
time,
Yep.
you cannot be thrown out,
Yeah.
unionized. So it's just, all of that stuff. So
Right.
so there is that social contract still exists. Like I would even go out and say, like, people will, in those regions, people will sell their limbs to get a job in coal India.
Right.
It's so high paid. It's like pensionable. Your generation is sorted. Yeah.
And the conversation isn't, because we talk about West Virginia
Yeah.
here, and we talk about the conversation sort of evolving, especially when reporters like you and me go out and we talk to people in coal mining country and we say, well, this is bad for the environment. What are you doing? We also need to realize that we're telling them that their livelihood is not good for the earth and for other people. It's a tough discussion to have. I imagine when you go to these places where coal reigns, that conversation isn't as easy as why don't we just transition away and go to solar and go to wind, right?
Yeah. I mean, anyway, that the fact that they can go to solar and wind, I'm not convinced. So that's a different,
Yeah.
maybe some of them, but not. This is a big ecosystem,
Hmm.
right? In many countries, this is a large ecosystem.
Hmm.
It's not just about coal or any particular, and any natural resource sector, any mono industry
Hmm.
is a big industry for that local region, right? It's an anchor industry. Everything revolves around it. It's not just those five mines. There are so many layers to this story. There's like contractors who supply equipment, people who load this coal in railways and trucks. So it's a large ecosystem which gets disrupted. And we don't know how to do this just transition at scale.
Right.
Like, there are examples in, Germany and Spain, but those are like 1,000 to 1,000 workers, lots of money. You can do that, but it's not easy in countries like India, where there's lots of informality,
Yeah.
informal workers, but also even in countries like US, because the scale is still very, very big, compared to, yeah.
You were talking to a former minister of coal, talking about that informality of the industry. Something like 80%
Yeah.
of that economic development, or that what's happening in the industry, is informal. Talk a little bit about, because I don't understand sort of how that
Yeah.
works.
So you can call it informal, you can call it illegal.
Sure.
People use all sorts of terms. So just to clarify that. So, and I'm glad we talked about the history of coal
Mm.
mining. So 200 years ago, many people were mining this coal, right? Like, they were mining this coal in their backyard. Now, so they did this, their children did this, their grandchildren did this. So for generations, they have been scavenging coal. And now you have a national company. So should they stop scavenging coal? They're still scavenging coal. Even though government of India has banned it, the state government, like, this is not. But these are very poor people just scavenging coal for basic needs.
Yeah.
People have quantified what that number could look like if you combine these millions of people scavenging coal and just selling. And a lot of this coal, by the way, goes to Bangladesh and other neighboring countries. And they make a little, this is what they have done for 5 generations, seven
Mm.
generations. um, in India's just transition, this is the elephant in the room.
Okay.
The direct jobs, the people who are in the coal industry, the contractors, yes, they will have issues, but they have unions, they have other people to advocate for their share in the just
Well,
run.
the municipal government, the state government, the
Yeah,
federal government. I mean, you
yeah,
have
yeah.
different layers, right?
But like, we don't even know who will represent them in this conversation.
Right.
Like, it's very informal. It's not even like legal. But these are very poor people, so they're not. I mean, there is layers to this again. Like, there are like poor people. There is also mafia. There's all kinds of kind of layers of informality, but it is a big source of
The,
you know.
the way that we talk about, and Josh and I have talked about this a little bit, you and I were speaking a little bit last night about it, but the idea of a transition, I feel like the way that we talk about it in this space often is that it's an inevitability, that it's going to happen, that we just have to figure out a way to make sure people get what they need as we transition away. In India, even in the United States, I would argue, there are some that say, Why are y'all talking about this as if it's going to happen or it has to happen?" What's the conversation among scholars, among people that you talk to, even people in those regions about, look, let's pump the brakes. This doesn't necessarily have to happen right now, right?
So, I mean, there's a spectrum,
Okay.
right? Like, there are obviously some people in India and others, whether they're in India or not, they think that this is not going to go. This is our bread and butter, not just from an employment point of view, but from an energy security point of view.
Right.
India doesn't have much gas, and or oil. So coal is the only domestic fossil fuel that India has. I mean, of course, renewables when they come in, and India needs to install 8,000 gigawatts to achieve its net zero.
Hmm.
Between 5,000 to 8,000. That's a huge scale
Yep.
to achieve. So, if you would have asked me this 5 years ago,
Hmm.
I would say most people don't take this stuff seriously. But what happened, and the way international policy manifests is very fascinating, is that in one of the conference of parties, I think it was in Glasgow, as COP26,
Hmm.
our prime minister, Indian prime minister, went and said India will achieve a net zero by 2070.
Right.
It's fascinating to me that many people in coal industries think that that's the end date.
Right.
Like, it could be the
It's
end
like a
date, but
journalist on
like,
deadline, right?
yeah,
Like,
like,
yeah,
so
yeah,
it suddenly became a deadline.
sure.
So it's still a very far away deadline, but from a conversation where coal could be 500 there for 500 years, even some directors of this large state-owned company think that 2070 is the last day of coal, which is true, but also now we have CCS and all. I mean, technically you can continue beyond that also, but nonetheless, that gave an opening for people who care about climate change, people who want India to be ambitious, at the same time meet their development goals. So there's no compromise on the development goals, but also be conscious of climate and do what is required. So that created an opening for for topics like just transition, for topics by like what Josh and others have done work on, looking at like can we close those inefficient coal plants and things like that. Before this, there was very little appetite, but because this overarching national framework came in, where this declaration happened, the way it percolated to the state government, to the
Hmm.
companies, to unions, it almost felt like that's the end date, which is not true. But anyway, nonetheless, it helps to have that larger end date in mind.
What was the incentive for that declaration? Was it, let's put India sort of on the map in terms of geopolitics, in terms of sort of the grand global stage of, look, this is what India is doing to sort of meet these goals?
Yeah, so part of it is also to show Indian leadership, but part of it is also, I would say, like every country was declaring at that COP. I mean, there are
You didn't
other
want to be left
people
out,
who
right?
have done this work
Yeah.
more deeply, but just from being an observer, I can just say, like, also like fear of missing out. And everybody was declaring and pressurizing. And so, India did not declare for 2050, it is 2070,
Hmm.
because it says, based on common but differentiated responsibility. We have not emitted historically, so we need more carbon space, more time. But just that declaration has been very instrumental in at least starting to talk about these topics, starting to just, you know, get into the weeds of like what that would mean and things like that.
One of the things you and I were talking about a little bit last night, and I think is sort of a meta issue with what we're talking about today, is this idea of whether or not there's tension between energy access for folks, whether it be electricity, whether it be reliable electricity, things like that, and a transition where if you're an Indian, a poor Indian in rural India who maybe has access to electricity a couple of days a week, and then somebody's coming in and saying, you know what, actually, we need you off of that coal. We need to figure out a way to get you cleaner electricity. You're going to say, well, I don't even have electricity now. Is there, have we made up this tension, or is there actual in the global South? Is there that tension that exists?
So I don't think there is tension within the country.
Okay.
The tension is coming from outside because many people in the West are particularly worried that if India goes the China route,
Right.
and if India's future development, per cap, for example, I'll take give us India's per capita electricity is 1,000 or 1,100 kilowatt hour.
Mhm.
World average is 3,000. China is 5,000. US is 14,000.
Right.
So forget about China or US. Even if India triples or becomes 4 or 5 times and uses coal, then it's a problem for climate. But it is not so much a tension within India.
Mm.
It is a tension that like it is enforced on India in terms of like you can leapfrog. You don't need to do the same things that West have done. But I think there are limits to leapfrogging at this stage. I mean, tell me a big country, not a small country, not a Denmark,
Sure.
not a you know. I mean, I have nothing against Denmark, but I'm just saying, not a Denmark or like Uruguay or like those are claiming like 100%.
Sure.
Tell me a big country, big, large country, maybe 100 million plus that has actually transitioned,
Right.
right? Transitioned from its dominant fossil fuel, right? Like there's no country. So it's not so much that India will not do its share. India has massive and really ambitious renewable targets, but India's strategy is all the above,
Mhm.
right? I want to lift my population out of poverty. So I need coal, I need renewables, I need nuclear, I need everything, gas. Like that's why you always hear in India, the top leadership they'll go to a gas region and say, India should become a gas-based economy.
Mm.
They'll go to a coal region and say India needs to become a coal-based economy.
Right.
And then third is like India is one of the most so India has the approach we need it all.
Right.
And the foundation of this is current emissions, but more importantly, current energy access and energy sort of per capita energy consumption is so low that as India urbanizes, industrializes, grows, even lifts people to provide 24 hours of stable electricity, basic kind of like services, India's energy demand will like triple and become 4 times. So
And
yeah,
that's the other thing that's important here too is even having access to that energy doesn't mean you're necessarily using it. So you could be energy poor
yeah.
or just not use energy. So the numbers, the data that you were talking about, the numbers say, "Oh my God, Indians don't use any of this power. They don't actually need any of this electricity." It's because they don't have actual access to it, right? And so the data, I'm curious about your perspective, especially with your background. If the Indian government is saying 99.9% of the people in India have access to electricity, uh, it's
it's
a little
not
squishy,
it's
right?
not reliable electric
Sure.
it is. So I think that this definition changed many times, but I think one of the definitions is like if you bring the transformer to the village and hook like 5 homes or 10 homes or something like that, that village is declared electrified.
Right.
um, However, having said that, the electrification drive has been massive,
Mhm.
right? It has changed the landscape. I think most people have some form of electricity access today, at village level, at local level. It's not reliable, but there is access. When I go back to India and my parents are like middle class, we have power cuts of
Mhm.
7 hours, 5 hours, almost. Especially in summer, it's like a peak hot. Like so, reliability and that is still a problem. But I think universal access has is more and more a reality now.
You were
Yeah.
talking a little bit about, a big country transitioning away from traditional fossil fuels. And I feel like the narrative specifically from fossil fuels here in the United States, at least, is certainly from the oil and gas industry, is why don't we let gas be that transition fuel, right? Let that awesome bridge that gets us to renewables. But if you're an oil and gas company, that means you have another 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of being a viable gas company. I'm curious from the Indian perspective, is that happening with coal where it's let's have coal be that sort of that bridge fuel.
Yeah, because there is no gas in the system. Or,
Right.
I mean, not there's some gas, but not the kind of gas India needs to replace anything.
Right.
Also, one very important factor is that India's carbonization, coal, like, so mining started in 71 from a national point of view, but India's coal field fleet, 50 or more percent of India's coal fleet was built in the last decade.
Hmm.
So these are young plants,
Yeah.
very, very young, on average 12, 13, 14 years. Very, very young coal plants. US average is 40 plus. So you're not going to shut down something you have just built. And just the hunger for energy
Yeah.
demand is a big driver for all this. So, and in other contexts it may be different, but in Indian context the coal use is increasing despite the massive growth of renewables, despite the growth of energy efficiency and all of that. Like the greenest projections will show you that coal use will be at least 30, 40, 50% more than it is today. So I mean, I think it'll be like foolish to say that there will be like coal will phase out or
Sure.
will peak anytime soon. But what can happen is like we should start by shutting down anything that is inefficient.
Right.
That I think is a very good short and medium term goal. Like, why burn too much when you can run one coal plant rather than three coal plants and burn less? Right. So that kind of stuff. Why do those underground mining, which is very dangerous? Do like uh, choose the lesser evil is what I'm saying. Like,
Right.
that's the short and medium term goal. And if we do this well, I think it will set the stage for the larger transition when maybe the battery storage will become so cheap and the whole game will shift. There's a little bit of uncertainty on the other side as well.
Hmm.
uh, while solar and wind costs have come down, but like, can you just stop coal and just, I don't think India can run on that as of today.
And this, you're speaking to some of the work that I know Josh and his colleagues have been thinking about and doing. Sort of the idea of transitioning away from those inefficiencies. Is the are the economics there for shutting these down? Is it a matter of um, retrofitting? Is it a matter of just shutting them down and opening up? Because if you need access to that energy, you got to figure out a way to produce it, right?
Yeah, so it goes, this is the good question. It goes back and forth.
Hmm.
So before the pandemic, and I think they wrote about this in their paper also, before the pandemic, when the energy demand was like low, people are at home, they're not traveling and all that. Um, there was like, oh, these coal plants are not, their plant load factors are very low, or they're not really using much, so let's just shut them down,
Yeah.
they're inefficient. But after COVID, now life is back to normal, and things are back to kind of normal. Energy demand is like 8%, electricity demand is 8%, 9%, 10%. So now they're like, oh, we should not do anything in a haste,
Hmm.
right? Let's wait.
Hmm.
Let's keep running even if they're inefficient. There are different methods, and people have done different kinds of analysis. What kinds of plants should be shut down? Should it be based on age? Should it be based on cost? And they have a paper that kind of synthesizes this work as well. So while it's cyclical, if the energy demand will again go down, I think this topic will come up again
Hmm.
of inefficiency and just shutting down, or just kind of like repurposing it to solar, or things like that. But since the demand is so high right now, I think I don't think anybody will go ahead and shut down at scale. Like a one or two here and there is different.
One of the things that I know people in the public policy and the political science space talk about all the time is getting the nomenclature right and the definitions, right? When I say just transition and you say just transition, I might have a different idea, and people in the United States might have a different idea of what it means to have a just transition. When you're talking about it and you're writing about it and you're producing articles and papers about it, imagine you've come up with what that definition what it means to be a just transition.
Yeah, it's a question that always comes up, And it's a great question because, like, whether it's in the academic space, whether it's in the real policy space, whether it's in the civil society space,
In the
if
journalism space too.
in the journalism space,
Yeah.
just transition means very different things to very different people. In Africa, just transition means energy access, right? In US, it means fossil fuel workers and communities. So there is space for everybody to define the way they want. The way I define it, and I have come to terms with it just from a practical point of view of what I can do, which is realistic.
Hmm.
Because, there is a whole spectrum. There are some groups that talk about just transition in the context of, like, sort of like, almost like overthrowing the economic system. And then there are some who are focused on individual coal workers. I'm somewhere in between.
Okay.
I want to look at winners and losers. Anyone who is losing, I'm not talking about CEO of large
Sure.
company, but anyone who is losing as a result of the energy transition from a mitigation side. People also talk about it from an adaptation side, but like from a mitigation side, whether it's in the coal industry or oil and gas industry, in the auto industry, whether it's people, communities, or regions. Uh, my definition of just transition is really about making sure those people, communities, and regions who lose out as a result of transition, we have ways to mitigate their losses. So that is the working definition for me, just to handle this topic, because it can be very, very broad. And then we think about, like, how do you start to think about it? What does it mean in real life? How do
Yeah.
you get to the policy side of it? So
And then
yeah.
that's what I was going to ask too. You've talked about and done surveys, I imagine, just asking people because when you're coming up with a definition, you need to know what that means for everyday people. For this is what it means for my daily life. The methodology, I imagine, has dovetailed from that definition.
Yeah, so the field in India and globally has evolved here. Um, it used to be this topic really used to be really about transformative change. But at some level, it was also about fossil fuel workers. Um, the way I have narrowed down this topic, even one level down, is when I think about just transition now, it's really about economic diversification. Like, any region that houses coal, oil, gas industries, how can they diversify?
Hmm.
I'm just simplifying it, because the more complex you make it, it's interesting from an intellectual point of view, but what does it really mean? So let me simplify even for one step further. Like, if you shut down something and we're doing this work in 3 counties in US, 3 districts in India. When you shut down, say, mining in Campbell County in Wyoming, where we are doing a lot of work,
Mm-hmm.
um, like, what are the 4 or 5 new sectors that can come in the future? They can be clean energy, but they can be something else as well. And clean energy, in the evidence that I have seen or worked on, clean energy may be a small part of the mix. It will definitely be like a really small part of the mix, honestly. So the real question is, what are the 5 or 6 sectors, or 10, pick your number,
Sure.
that this county or that this state can diversify into? um, and how do you get there?
Yep.
Like, what policies, levers, changes are required to get there? This itself, though narrow, is a very tough question.
It is, and I think you're speaking to something that I've been talking to people about a lot, is this idea specifically here in the United States and the Biden administration. Nothing against them, because this is sort of how policy generally works, is okay, we need to get rid of that coal in Wyoming or West Virginia. And so we'll go ahead and just replace it with solar or wind. But it's like, there's a reason that those coal mines are there. It's because the coal is there. It may not make sense for there to be solar or there to be wind there, just in terms of the science, right? But because you think we need to replace those energy jobs, those dirty, quote unquote, dirty energy jobs with clean energy jobs, let's just figure out a way to incentivize that industry to come here. I imagine
Right.
that's the same discussion.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something I explored a lot in my PhD dissertation as well. So the spatial geography of fossil fuels and the spatial geography of where clean energy is growing in most countries, not all.
Mm,
And there are some places where there is overlap, but in most places there is almost no overlap. In
mhm,
India, coal is in central and eastern India. All the renewable stuff, most 90% of renewables is in southern and so even if you assume that they can replace, they're happening in different places within the
mhm.
country, and these are big countries. Look at US. You know, where is it happening? In California, and but West Virginia is so far away, so people will take this is not like an oil and gas camp that and
Everybody gets in their RV and just goes
yeah, yeah,
there, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
so there's that issue. The second layer of issue is just the salary, the
yeah.
the compensation. I mean, I think the nature of these jobs are very different.
Sure.
Like, you have a lot of jobs, especially in the installations phase,
Mhm.
2 years, 3 years. And then, I mean, I visited this large 1 gigawatt solar facility. So at the construction stage, there was a lot of jobs
Sure.
and people. But after that, I visited. There were like 5 engineers, 10 engineers,
Just sort of monitoring
and
stuff.
100 security guards.
Yeah.
Just because it's India, so people, I don't know if so. I mean, it's not. You cannot compare that to a mining ecosystem, which is a little bit broader. There are layers of this and all that. So I don't think one-to-one replacement is possible. What approach should be a cluster of industries and
Mhm.
an early planning. So a lot of my work is just focused on this one question now, on the just transition piece, like how can places diversify? And we're running large scale surveys on the ground. We're collecting data. We're trying to see what policies need to change, both in India and in the United States. And that is where the field is moving now.
That's what I was gonna ask you too. Is it a matter of understanding where the talent is? If if you have a university town in West Virginia, then maybe we bring a tech, industry up there. Is it just a matter of figuring out those economic incentives through, I guess, the feds, through state governments? Tell me sort of like how does that work?
Yeah, so the way we are approaching is even like one step behind what
Okay,
where you are. So the first stage is, let's ask people, like, they are from there, right? Like, why should we do a technical analysis and say, oh, this resource looks good here? So first, for what we did is we did household surveys.
hmm,
So we asked people, right? We asked people like, what are the 5 sectors you want to get into? And they came up with a list. Like, for example, in India, in one district, people are interested in solar assembly.
sure,
People are interested in religious tourism. They're saying there were lots of temples in this area before, mining industry. Mining industry has been big, but there's a lot of temples here. Why can't we revive those temples?
huh,
That will generate a lot. So different places will have different lists. We took those lists and then we did an industrial survey. So local entrepreneurs, companies, businesses, we asked them, like, here's what people, households are saying. Do you want to do any of this? And or if you don't want to do any of this, what else?
yeah,
And what do you need to do that? So at this moment, we have done that study, we're analyzing the data, and it's just fascinating. I mean, people are saying, just give us cheap finance, we'll run with it.
hmm,
You don't need anything. Some are saying, like, just in some districts in India, they're saying, just make sure law and order is working, we'll take care of it. Like, we know the sectors, but it's really hard to operate. And so that's the kind of, and within that, the next stage of work is then to take this work out and explain what policy changes are required.
right,
So it's almost like bottom up rather than, here's a policy, how
yeah,
do I tweak to, reach that policy and all that. So
and
it's more of
and
a bottom up.
the bottom up, I imagine, continues on with you start with the municipal government, county governments, things like that, and then you move up to the state,
Correct.
then you move to the feds, right?
Correct. I mean, I think we need more and more evidence. So just doing surveys in 3 counties in US is not
Sure.
enough. I think, uh, I mean, what I would imagine is, like, in the next 5 years, if we we collective, everybody who is working on this topic, and I know others are also looking at this, if we can collect data from 100 counties of this granular detailed data, then you can create a pattern and recognize that pattern of what is that policy change that is required to drive economic diversification. And it will definitely, this I can say, it will not be clean energy alone, for sure. It
Sure.
can be a part, but it is not the only thing.
You talked about a few. We have a few elephants in the room here. The Indian elections are happening right now. Um, I'm curious from your perspective, the discussions that are happening among voters, the discussions that are happening among ministers about energy topics, and not necessarily even just the transition or things like that, but just energy generally. Is it a concern for voters? Is it something that those politicians are discussing?
Yeah, so election is a great time in India where every political party is and goes and talks about like free power,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Because
that
power in electricity in India is heavily subsidized, right? Like we
heavily
should, yeah.
subsidized for the farmers and it's it's overcharged to the industries.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. And so industry basically pays for a lot of
Pays for,
residential, right?
and
Yeah.
now so the industry is more interested in renewables now because they could, or captive coal plants, either of those.
Right.
Um,
Essentially microgrids for their industry.
Essentially, yeah, like yeah, so that is always a topic. When we come, we'll give you free electricity, and
Sure.
like, I mean, every, like, it's almost like if one party says like I will give you free, the other will, say something
We'll pay
like
you.
pay you or
Pay to use
whatever.
our
Yeah, yeah.
electricity.
So
Right.
that is definitely uh, one of the major topics.
Hmm.
There, I've also heard about like 24/7, like it's not just that you don't have to pay, but like we'll also give you 24/7 power,
Sure.
and those kinds of things. So that is always in every election. That is really a topic.
Hmm.
Yeah, that
And
comes up.
and again, like I was saying, it's not necessarily about how we generate that power or how we generate that electricity. It's just access and cost.
Yes, exactly. And but that doesn't mean like uh, other things are not important,
Right.
but yes, it's really about access. It's not so much about what is the source.
Got you.
Yeah.
In terms of, is there opportunity for advocacy groups in India to sort of start having this conversation? If you're worried about a just transition, if you're worried about sort of ramping up of coal, and you're an environmental group in India and elections are happening right now, is there a platform where you can say, hey, I know you're worried about access, I know you're worried about cost, but we should also be thinking about use or generation, or is that just kind of far down the line?
So climate is still not a mainstream topic.
Okay.
It's grown exponentially, but it's not a election issue. It is, in no political party has mentioned climate change in their manifestos
Gotcha.
that they release. So it's not really a main kind of topic. It's not debated in TV. It's not written about. So there's little space or interest on this. There are, and the reason is simple. For a country like India, where people are poor and there's other day-to-day burning issues.
Sure.
So in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people's aspirations and people's problems are quite immediate, and climate still, even though they feel, it's more hot and there's
Air
floods and
pollution and
air
yeah,
pollution,
yeah.
but it's still not a political topic yet.
Hmm.
It can change in 5 or 10 years, but it's still not there yet.
Because so
There's
much of
more
it is economic.
awareness for sure.
It's about economic development.
Economic, yeah.
That makes sense.
And we were just talking previously, but for countries like India, emissions alone will never be a driver of climate action. It
Hmm.
has to be emissions and development.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
You talked about the goals and you talked about sort of the lofty goals, and especially at conferences like COP in Glasgow. How's India doing? Again, you talked about how it's not necessarily a part of the everyday conversation, but at the same time, you're monitoring these things, and we're sort of looking at, okay, if you want to reach these goals, this is the reality of the situation. How is India looking?
So India has set very ambitious
Mm,
targets, right? 500 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, large energy efficiency goals, goals for, EVs, all kinds of like climate action stuff. But implementation is always, that's a tricky word.
yeah.
So goals are all there, and if India meets some of those goals, there is, but it's not just about this stuff. Like general implementation in a country like India is quite challenging.
Hmm,
Whether so India also has targets to double coal,
sure.
but I'm also suspicious of that. So while I'm suspicious of, like, where, I mean, it doesn't really matter if India doesn't meet 500, but they're at like 400 of it's still very good.
Right.
But overall, I think there is momentum for renewables. There is absolute support from the top. There is state governments that are ambitious about it. There are companies, there are fossil fuel companies that have created business development divisions and have set targets of 10 gigawatt, 15 gigawatts. So there is 100% momentum, there is interest,
There's
but
also business opportunity for those, right?
business
Yeah.
opportunity. But the scale of this stuff is huge,
Yeah.
and among many challenges, land is going to be a major constraint in a densely populated country.
Surface area, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
surface area.
and then when you're talking about solar, when you're talking about wind,
Right.
that's the again, that's another
Yeah, yeah.
elephant in the room. Josh, do we have any I wanted to open it up to questions, or if you have anything you wanted to ask Sandeep, this has been wonderful.
Sure. There's a question or a comment in the chat that says, I agree with Sandeep. There's one essential ingredient that is required to increase the standard of living of people in any country, the availability of abundant, reliable, and affordable energy. And they note that some of the challenges associated with installing renewables. And I guess the question I have is, you we talked about how climate might be a weak driver of political change in the country, but one of the analyses that we've seen from the University of Chicago, for example, on air pollution is that the life expectancy in India would go up by an average of 5.3 years if India were to reduce its air pollution levels to those that the World Health Organization recommends. And so on some level, it's almost you know, that could be a driver one day, but it hasn't been. And I guess the question is, why not?
It's a great question, but I just go back to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? I mean, uh, most people don't realize how precarious life is in India, right? People are living on like 100 rupees, like $2, $3. And what is the life? Like you're working 10 hours a day, you're getting that money, just struggling to put your child. I'm not painting a very, like, I'm not trying to paint a bad picture here, but that is a reality for many people. And it's a hard life, to live. And even if after that you're facing this air pollution and you're having, you're breathing that air, like I don't think you have the time or the bandwidth or i- to actually go and kind of protest about it. I mean, there are protests that happen. This is a very urban topic as well. Like, I mean, when there is massive, shoot up of AQI, in Delhi, there are newspapers that cover it. It is becoming more and more mainstream, but I think, general development issues are just paramount. Like, I think people just need basics of like jobs and, general welfare, and that, and education and health, that supersedes everything, every kind of environmental or climate concern.
And I think Josh is speaking of this too. It's sort of it's a timeline issue too. If you're worried about um, how do I make the next month's rent, I'm not worried about 5.2 years of my life when I'm 75 or when I'm 65, right? And so it's sort of maybe it's the immediacy. Does that make
Exactly.
sense?
Exactly. So, like, what do I need this month? Right. And like, if I go and if I go and plan a protest, for example, about air pollution, I won't have wages. So, it's really like, how do I live my life? How do I pay my rent? For most common people, not middle class, which is, about 10-20% of India,
Hmm.
but below that, this is driving their day-to-day, you know, life. And eh, these things are changing, but it is not there yet. There's more awareness, there's more reporting on climate and air pollution now than 5 years ago,
Hmm.
including in regional languages. But will that awareness that, okay, this is a problem, lead to people actually, making this an election issue, protesting, or, saying that you have to do something, like making it a priority? That's a bit of a shift that is required.
It sounds too like you had talked about sort of the bottom up approach to your methodology and to your thinking about this problem. If you're talking about what the World Health Organization suggests in terms of air pollution, that, and not that it's necessarily a bad sort of way to go about things, but that would seem like it would be more of from the ministerial level, where it would be a top down, hey, these are the goals that the world is putting out there that we need to meet, kind of like what you're doing at Glasgow and COP. Sort of this idea of we have a responsibility to our people, to our voters, right?
I think both are very important. I mean, the more I work on climate, the more I'm convinced that you need both top down and bottom up approach. And you have to find that sweet spot
Mhm.
between the top down and the bottom up. And both can feed into each other. And, like, for example, I'm just switch. If I think about just transition, like just doing this bottom up work won't be useful. You need to engage the top as well. So
Mhm.
because this bottom up could provide evidence, then you influence the top, so the dollars flow and things like that. So for every topic, it's kind of really local to global. You need that local to global approach if you want to work on a topic. And people can choose, like, hey, I will only focus on local stuff, but then, somebody should put together the local and to global connection and kind of bring it together.
Go ahead, Josh.
And that raises the issue of, for American audiences, that as we were seeing in the U.S., the energy transition is complex and difficult and challenging. But from a climate perspective, we might think it's necessary, and American audiences look to India and worry about India, if India's future looks like China's recent development past, that's a problem for everyone.
Correct.
And but then there's, we see the reality unfolding in India, and then it's, if the U.S. wants India to have a different trajectory, how can it help incentivize that, given the real development needs on the ground? And so, I guess that's an open question, because, there's a lot of whataboutism in the U.S. where, well, if China and India won't act, we don't, and we won't. But that's not satisfying, because we'll all bear the brunt of the climate crisis. And so I guess, we're kind of coming up near
Yeah.
the end. One question for Sandeep is, like, what would be the message for American audiences of how the U.S. and other international actors can help India overcome some of these complex implementation challenges?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Let me borrow something. I was just talking to Professor Arvind Ravikumar, who is here. He had once tweeted something that it's almost, I could frame that tweet. Why is it that in US, I mean, energy transitions are complex everywhere in the world, right? Like, but why is it that when it comes to US issues, it's so nuanced, right? Like we're getting into like the weeds of the weeds of the weeds. But when it comes to India, or for that matter, China also, like why is India not phasing out coal?
Right.
So
Right.
it's very, you have to go nuanced. And I think uh, universities like yours can play a leading role in sort of like painting that complexity, right? It's why should it be zero or one,
Mm.
right? Like why can't we like think about some things that are possible, some things that are not possible today but could be possible in 2 years? So that nuanced understanding and just educating, I guess, the Western audience, or at least those who are in power, or whether those who are advocating for such like ambitious action, I think that'll be very useful.
It,
And
it
not being arrogant about it.
yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say is that
Yeah.
it's also a safe bailout for the community, for politicians, where you can be like, well, no, if India is not going to do anything, why, like, why should we have to do anything? It's sort of that, I joke about it all the time, but it's like, yeah, but I compost. Like I drive, 3 F-150s, but I compost. So everything's cool. There's a little bit of that where it's like, why is it on us, the developed countries who, made out like bandits for all these years? Why is it on us if they're not going to actually do anything? Like we're sort of looking to the global south and we're looking to developing countries and it gets back to this idea of like we're going to have to ask less of developing countries than we put on ourselves, and that's just a reality. That's just sort of what we have to realize in the United States.
One answer might be,
Hmm.
can we make battery storage cheap? If we can make it cheap here, can it become cheap everywhere?
Yeah.
And that may not just simply be something that the US does, but China does. And that may make it possible that the intermittent wind and solar, that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, but if we can store it up for when we need it, if that challenge can be broken here in the US, it could maybe help India succeed as well.
Yeah, and I think the real way to solve this is never going to be zero or one. The answer will be in the middle always, and that complexity of what is possible, what is not possible, what is practical, what is not practicable, etc. And the other thing I would just say to the US audience is like, if you can show ambition and show that you're actually transitioning, like, why are we not talking about oil and gas transition? Why only coal?
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
that would mean US leadership to me, right? Because it's easy to talk about a fuel which is already on its way out.
Sure.
But so I think just being humble about it, just being like, hey, we're all doing it. Let's collaborate, build partnerships, and work together. I think that will go a much longer way than going to countries like India and preaching, right?
Right.
Like, oh, you're
Right.
coal.
When you point your finger, you have three pointing back at you,
Yeah.
right? Sort of that idea. No, this has been wonderful. Sandeep Pai, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We're all out of time, y'all. Thank you for joining us online. This will be, like I said, this will be posted online. If you have follow-up comments, anything like that, send us emails, send us comments on online where it's posted. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Yeah, of
Andy, and
course.
thank you, Professor Josh Busby. Yeah. Thank you.